This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The prestigious Nishikawa Academy in Tokyo was a beacon of academic excellence and social prestige. Nestled in a modern district surrounded by sleek office buildings and bustling streets, the school catered to the children of wealthy families, high-ranking officials, and ambitious middle-class parents hoping to secure their children's future. Its minimalist architecture, pristine hallways, and meticulously maintained gardens exuded an air of order and discipline. On the surface, it was the epitome of a successful academic institution, a place where promising students honed their skills and prepared for Japan's fiercely competitive university entrance exams. Inside its gleaming walls, however, Nishikawa Academy was a pressure cooker. The students carried heavy expectations, their days filled with long classes, rigorous exams, and extracurricular activities that left little room for error or individuality. Teachers were demanding, their lessons moving at an unforgiving pace, leaving slower students behind. The social dynamics among the students were equally unyielding, governed by an unspoken hierarchy dictated by wealth, charm, and academic prowess. Those at the top enjoyed a kind of untouchable status, while those at the bottom were treated with disdain or outright ignored. In this environment was Natsumi Hayashi, a 15-year-old second-year student who had learned to navigate the school's social labyrinth by making herself as invisible as possible. Natsumi came from a struggling household in one of Tokyo's older neighborhoods, far removed from the glitzy lifestyle her classmates took for granted. Her father worked long hours at a factory, and her mother was a part-time clerk, their combined incomes barely enough to cover Natsumi's tuition and the bare minimum of her needs. Unlike her peers, who carried designer bags and wore the latest accessories, Natsumi's belongings were plain and utilitarian, making her an easy target for ridicule. Physically, Natsumi was unremarkable. Her thin frame and quiet demeanor made her easy to overlook, her straight black hair often hanging in her face as if to shield her from the world. She wore her school uniform neatly but without flair, her polished shoes and ironed blazer in stark contrast to the fashionable flourishes her classmates added to their appearances. Despite her efforts to blend in, her very ordinariness made her stand out in a school filled with polished, confident teenagers who thrived on competition, both academic and social. Within the classroom, Natsumi occupied the unspoken role of the loner. She sat at the back of the room, her head bowed over her notebook, trying to keep up with the relentless pace of the lessons. While other students whispered, passed notes, or made plans for after-school outings, Natsumi remained silent, her presence barely acknowledged. The few times she attempted to join in, her classmates brushed her off with indifferent looks or thinly veiled sneers. They mocked her quietly, their taunts just loud enough for her to hear but soft enough to escape the notice of the teachers. The bullying was rarely overt but instead took the form of microaggressions that slowly eroded Natsumi's sense of self. Her desk was often scribbled on with crude jokes or insults. Her textbooks were mysteriously misplaced. During group assignments, forcing her to scramble for replacements while her classmates snickered. At lunch, she ate alone, her bento box balanced precariously on her knees as the other students gathered in tight-knit groups, their laughter filling the air. The worst moments came during physical education, where Natsumi's awkwardness made her an easy scapegoat for every team's failures, her peers' mocking jeers echoing in her ears. Teachers, either overwhelmed by the demands of the curriculum or unwilling to address the underlying issues, largely ignored the social dynamics in their classrooms. As long as the students maintained good grades and avoided outright disruptions, the teachers turned a blind eye to the subtle bullying that permeated the halls. Even when Natsumi's grades began to slip, her teachers merely scolded her for not keeping up, their words laden with disappointment but devoid of support. They never asked why she struggled or how they might help, their focus solely on maintaining the school's reputation for excellence. Natsumi's home life offered little reprieve. Her parents, though hardworking, were emotionally distant, consumed by their own struggles to make ends meet. Her father, perpetually exhausted from long shifts at the factory, often snapped at her for minor mistakes, while her mother's attempts at comfort were half-hearted and fleeting. The family rarely shared meals together, their schedules too chaotic to align. Natsumi spent most of her evenings alone in her small bedroom, surrounded by stacks of textbooks and the hum of the city beyond her window. The only place where Natsumi felt any semblance of control was online. Late at night, she would lose herself in forums and chat rooms, gravitating toward spaces that echoed her anger and loneliness. These digital worlds became her sanctuary, a place where she could vent her frustrations and find solace in the anonymity they provided. But they were also a breeding ground for darker thoughts. Stories of revenge and violence began to captivate her, their characters mirroring her own feelings of invisibility and helplessness. She found herself drawn to these narratives, their stark portrayal of power and retribution offering her a grim kind of hope. The school itself seemed indifferent to the undercurrents of discontent that brewed among its students. The hallways, lined with motivational posters and displays of academic achievements, masked the reality of a toxic environment where pressure and bullying thrived. The administration focused on maintaining the school's pristine image, their glossy brochures and high rankings hiding the cracks in their system. To them, Natsumi was just another quiet, struggling student and anomaly in their sea of overachievers, but not a cause for concern. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of Natsumi's isolation became unbearable. Every smirk from her classmates, every ignored hand raised in class, every harsh word from her father added another layer to the storm brewing within her. The school, with its bright lights and bustling corridors, had become a prison, and Natsumi, trapped within its walls, began to see only one way out. The dynamics of Nishikawa Academy, so carefully constructed to produce success, had unwittingly set the stage for a tragedy no one could foresee. Natsumi Hayashi's life was a quiet, unending battle waged beneath the surface of her unremarkable existence. To anyone looking in from the outside, she was simply another student navigating the demands of high school, a little withdrawn, perhaps, but certainly not unusual. Yet beneath her silent demeanor, Natsumi carried the crushing weight of her struggles, each one compounding into a storm that no one saw building. She lived in a world where every glance from her classmates, every word from her teachers, and every interaction with her family seemed to echo a singular, undeniable truth: she did not belong. From the moment she first stepped into the prestigious halls of Nishikawa Academy, Natsumi felt like an outsider. The other students came from affluent families, their lives filled with privilege and opportunities that Natsumi could only dream of. They wore their confidence like armor, walking the halls with ease, their laughter a constant backdrop to her silence. In contrast, Natsumi was a shadow, her movements quiet and deliberate, her presence barely acknowledged. Her family's financial struggles marked her as different. While her classmates carried designer bags and wore the latest accessories, Natsumi's belongings were secondhand or plain. The difference, though rarely voiced outright, was palpable. Her social isolation was not immediate, but it grew steadily as the months passed. At first, her classmates had extended tentative invitations to join group activities, but Natsumi's shy, hesitant nature made her seem aloof. Soon, the invitations stopped. The cliques within the class solidified, and Natsumi found herself on the fringes, watching from a distance as her peers bonded over shared experiences she could never access. The feeling of exclusion gnawed at her, a constant reminder of her inability to connect with those around her. The bullying started small. A snicker when she mispronounced a word during a class presentation. A joke whispered too loudly as she walked past. Notes left on her desk with crude drawings of her hunched figure or mocking comments about her clothes. At first, Natsumi tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it didn't matter. But the taunts grew bolder, more frequent, until they became an unavoidable part of her daily life. She would often find her desk defaced with obscenities or her belongings accidentally knocked to the floor. Her classmates' cruelty was subtle enough to escape the attention of the teachers, but sharp enough to leave deep scars on her psyche. Her home offered little refuge from the relentless pressure of school. Natsumi's parents were hardworking but distant, their lives consumed by the struggle to make ends meet. Her father worked grueling hours at a factory, his body worn and his patience thin. He spoke to Natsumi only to reprimand her, his voice sharp with frustration whenever she failed to meet his expectations. Her mother, a part-time store clerk, was well-meaning but overwhelmed, her attempts at kindness often drowned out by her exhaustion. Their cramped apartment, with its peeling wallpaper and faint smell of mildew, felt less like a home and more like another reminder of how little they had. As her isolation deepened, Natsumi began to turn inward. She spent hours alone in her bedroom, her only company the faint hum of traffic from the street below. Her textbooks and notebooks sat unopened on her desk, the thought of studying rendered meaningless by the constant weight of her despair. Instead, she filled her time with drawing. Her sketches were raw and chaotic, filled with jagged lines and shadowy figures. She drew scenes of confinement rooms with no doors, hallways that stretched endlessly into darkness. These images became her only form of expression, the only outlet for the emotions she couldn't put into words. Late at night, when the city outside fell silent, Natsumi would retreat into the world of the internet. Here, in the anonymity of forums and chat rooms, she found a strange kind of solace. She gravitated toward spaces that echoed her own feelings of anger and loneliness, places where others vented their frustrations about the world. But these spaces also fed her darker impulses. Stories of revenge and violence began to captivate her. She read them obsessively, drawn to the idea of reclaiming control in a world that had stripped her of power. The characters in these stories weren't victims, they were fighters, taking back what had been taken from them, no matter the cost. Natsumi began to fantasize about what it would be like to finally be seen. The thought terrified her, but it also exhilarated her. She imagined standing in front of her classmates, their mocking laughter silenced, their eyes wide with fear as they finally understood the pain they had caused her. These fantasies grew more vivid with each passing day, filling her mind during the quiet moments when she was alone. She knew they were wrong, that they were born of anger and despair, but she couldn't stop them. They offered her a kind of escape, a way to imagine a life where she was no longer invisible. The pressure around her continued to mount. Her grades, once passable, began to plummet, drawing sharp criticism from her teachers and her father. Her classmates' bullying became more overt, their taunts echoing in her ears long after the school day ended. Her mother's brief moments of kindness were overshadowed by her father's anger, his voice a constant reminder of how much Natsumi had failed to live up to their expectations. Every part of her life felt like it was closing in on her, the walls tightening around her until there was no room left to breathe. Natsumi's hidden struggles were invisible to those around her, buried beneath her quiet demeanor and the routine of daily life. Her classmates saw her as a target, her teachers saw her as a failing student, and her parents saw her as a disappointment. No one saw the storm building within her, the thoughts that grew darker and sharper with each passing day. She was alone, her pain unnoticed, her voice unheard. And as the pressure reached its breaking point, Natsumi began to see only one way to make herself visible in a world that had refused to see her. The days leading up to the tragedy at Nishikawa Academy were a blur of tension and quiet planning for Natsumi Hayashi. On the surface, her life continued as it always had, long, grueling school days followed by evenings spent in the solitude of her bedroom. Yet beneath her unassuming exterior, something within her had shifted. The weight of her anger, despair, and humiliation had grown unbearable, transforming into a cold determination that consumed her every thought. Her fantasies of revenge, once fleeting daydreams, began to solidify into a plan. It began with her growing obsession with the tools she would need. Natsumi started researching weapons late at night, her searches careful and deliberate, mindful of leaving no obvious trail. The thought of guns was dismissed quickly. They were too difficult to obtain and too loud for what she envisioned. Instead, she turned her focus to knives, silent, accessible, and intimate. She spent hours reading about blade types, their weight, and their effectiveness. When she finally settled on the knives she wanted, she used her meager savings to purchase them at a nondescript shop far from her neighborhood, where the cashier barely glanced at her. She brought the knives home in her school bag, their presence both terrifying and thrilling. At home, Natsumi practiced late at night, her bedroom door locked. She held the knives in her hands, testing their weight, getting used to the way the cool metal felt against her skin. She practiced quick, decisive movements, imagining the scenarios she might face. She didn't feel fear, only a strange calm, as if she were rehearsing for a performance she knew she had to deliver flawlessly. She carefully hid the knives in the back of her closet, wrapped in an old sweatshirt, and resumed her nightly routine as if nothing had changed. At school, The bullying continued unabated, each incident pushing Natsumi closer to the edge. Her classmates, sensing her vulnerability, seemed to delight in finding new ways to humiliate her. They spilled water on her chair before she sat down, leaving her to spend the rest of the day in damp discomfort. They wrote cruel messages on her notebooks when she wasn't looking, mocking her for her appearance and her family's financial situation. During gym class, they threw her shoes onto the roof, forcing her to beg the janitor for help retrieving them. Each insult, each slight, fed the growing storm within her, hardening her resolve. The final straw came one afternoon during lunch. Natsumi sat alone at her usual spot near the window, her bento box balanced carefully on her lap. A group of her classmates approached her, their laughter sharp and cruel. They knocked the box from her hands, its contents spilling onto the floor. They sneered as they walked away, their mocking voices echoing in her ears. Natsumi knelt to clean up the mess, her hands shaking with anger and humiliation. As she picked up the scattered rice and broken chopsticks, something inside her snapped. The plan she had been formulating for weeks suddenly felt inevitable, as if the choice had already been made for her. Over the next few days, Natsumi's focus sharpened. She began mapping out the school, mentally noting every exit, every hallway, and every blind spot. She memorized her classmates' schedules, observing their routines and movements with meticulous attention to detail. She decided that lunchtime would be the best opportunity when the classroom was full and everyone was distracted. She imagined how it would unfold, each step playing out in her mind with perfect clarity. She wasn't acting out of impulse, every detail was considered, every possibility accounted for. Natsumi's demeanor changed subtly, though no one seemed to notice. Her usual nervous energy was replaced by a strange calm, her movements deliberate and precise. She no longer flinched at her classmates' taunts or avoided their glances. Instead, she watched them with an eerie detachment, as though they were characters in a play she was directing. Her teachers, preoccupied with preparing for midterms, mistook her silence for focus, praising her newfound dedication. Her parents remained oblivious, too wrapped up in their own struggles to notice this shift in their daughter. The night before the attack, Natsumi sat in her room, the knives laid out before her on her desk. She inspected each one carefully, wiping the blades clean and checking for any imperfections. She packed them into her school bag with the same precision she used to pack her books, their weight grounding her. As she zipped the bag shut, she felt a strange sense of peace, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She slept soundly that night, her mind free of the usual racing thoughts that plagued her. When morning came, she followed her routine as always, eating breakfast in silence while her parents argued quietly in the next room. She walked to school under a gray sky, the city's noise fading into the background as she focused on the day ahead. The plan was set, and there was no room for doubt. As she entered the school gates, the familiar sights and sounds of Nishikawa Academy washed over her. Students laughed and chatted in groups, their voices blending into a cacophony of privilege and ease. Natsumi walked past them, unnoticed as always, her school bag heavy against her shoulder. She felt no fear, only a cold certainty that today everything would change. The classroom buzzed with the familiar sounds of lunchtime at Nishikawa Academy. Students clustered in tight-knit groups, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they shared bentos and swapped stories about upcoming exams or weekend plans. The windows were open, letting in a faint breeze that carried the distant hum of city traffic. The teacher's desk at the front of the room sat empty, its occupant having stepped out for a break. For most students, it was an ordinary day, another in the long stretch of school life that blended into routine. But for Natsumi Hayashi, it was the moment she had been preparing for. Natsumi sat in her usual spot at the back of the classroom, her hands resting on her closed school bag. She had barely touched her lunch, her appetite replaced by a cold, steady focus. Her classmates barely glanced at her, as was typical. To them, she was invisible, a ghost that lingered on the edges of their lives. But today, Natsumi's presence would be impossible to ignore. She waited until the room was at its noisiest, her heart beating a steady rhythm in her chest, her breath slow and measured. Then, without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out the knives. The first moments were chaos. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor as she stood caught the attention of the nearest group, their faces shifting from mild annoyance to confusion as they saw the glint of metal in her hand. Natsumi moved quickly, her body propelled by weeks of planning and a single-minded determination. Her first target was a boy who had spent months mocking her during lunch breaks, his laughter a constant reminder of her isolation. The knife struck with brutal precision, silencing him mid-sentence. The room erupted into screams as blood pooled on the floor, the laughter replaced by cries of panic. Natsumi didn't stop. She moved methodically through the room, her focus unwavering as she targeted the students who had tormented her the most. The girl who had spilled water on her desk, the boy who had shoved her in the hallway, the group that had humiliated her by destroying her bento box one by one. They fell under her blade. The classroom became a scene of utter chaos, desks and chairs overturned as students scrambled to escape. Some ran for the door. But Natsumi had anticipated this. She had locked it from the inside before the lunch break began, ensuring that no one could leave until she was done. The confined space amplified the panic. Students pushed and shoved, their screams echoing off the walls as they tripped over fallen chairs and each other in their desperation to flee. The smell of blood filled the air, sharp and metallic, mixing with the faint scent of lunchboxes now abandoned on the floor. Natsumi's classmates, who had once dismissed her as weak and unimportant, now looked at her with terror. Their faces blurred together in her mind, their screams a distant noise that barely registered. She felt no remorse, no hesitation, only a chilling sense of control as she continued her attack. The room grew quieter as the minutes passed. Some students managed to barricade themselves in a corner, huddling together and holding up desks as makeshift shields. Others lay still on the ground, their bodies motionless in pools of blood. Natsumi's movements slowed as the resistance dwindled, her once methodical strikes now more deliberate. She was covered in blood, her uniform soaked through, her breathing heavy but controlled. The knives in her hands were slick, but she gripped them tightly, refusing to let go. Her classmates' pleas for mercy went unanswered, their voices fading into silence as she finished what she had started. The last moments were eerily quiet. The classroom, once filled with life and energy, now felt like a tomb. Desks and chairs were scattered in disarray, some splintered and broken from the chaos. Blood stained the walls and floors, its dark red stark against the pale beige of the classroom. The few survivors, trembling and pale, watched Natsumi from behind their barricades, their eyes wide with fear. Natsumi stood in the center of the room, her knives hanging limply at her sides, her chest rising and falling with each measured breath. For the first time in years, she felt seen. The sound of distant footsteps snapped her back to reality. Someone had likely heard the commotion and alerted the authorities. Natsumi knew her time was limited. She dropped the knives, their metallic clatter echoing in the silence, and walked toward the door. She unlocked it with steady hands, stepping into the hallway as teachers and students from nearby classrooms rushed toward her. Gasps and screams filled the corridor as they saw the blood covering her uniform and the empty expression on her face. She didn't try to run. There was nowhere to go, and she didn't want to leave. This, she thought, was exactly how it was meant to end. The police arrived minutes later, their presence heralded by the wail of sirens that cut through the stunned silence of the school grounds. Natsumi stood motionless as officers approached her, their voices cautious but firm. She offered no resistance as they placed her in handcuffs, her eyes fixed on the ground. Behind her, the classroom was cordoned off, its shattered remains a grim testament to what had unfolded. The survivors were led away, their sobs and whispers filling the air as paramedics arrived to tend to the injured. As Natsumi was escorted out of the school, the weight of what she had done began to settle over her. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a hollow emptiness, as though the act itself had taken something from her that she hadn't realized she needed. The screams of her classmates no longer echoed in her ears, replaced by a suffocating silence. For the first time, she wondered if the price of being seen had been too high. The aftermath of the attack at Nishikawa Academy left an indelible scar on the school, the city of Tokyo, and the lives of everyone touched by the tragedy. In the hours following the incident, the once prestigious school became a scene of chaos and horror. Ambulances lined the streets outside the gates, their flashing lights painting the stone walls in shades of red and blue. Paramedics rushed in and out of the building, their hands stained with blood as they carried the injured to safety. The survivors, their faces pale and their bodies trembling, huddled together on the school grounds, some sobbing uncontrollably, others staring into the distance, as if unable to process what they had witnessed. The media descended on the scene almost immediately, their cameras capturing every grim detail. Images of bloodied floors, overturned desks, and shattered windows were broadcast across the nation, accompanied by the harrowing accounts of students and teachers who had escaped the carnage. The story dominated headlines. The words "massacre at Nishikawa Academy" splashed across newspapers and television screens. Reporters speculated about the identity of the attacker, their motives, and how such a tragedy could occur in one of Tokyo's most prestigious institutions. The city, and soon the entire country, was gripped by a sense of shock and disbelief. Natsumi Hayashi, the perpetrator of the attack, was arrested on the spot without resistance. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, her blood-stained uniform stark against her pale, expressionless face, became one of the most widely circulated photographs in the days that followed. Her calm demeanor unnerved the officers who apprehended her, as if she were detached from the chaos she had caused. Taken to a juvenile detention center, she was placed under constant surveillance. She neither spoke nor reacted to the questions thrown at her, her silence amplifying the mystery surrounding her actions. The investigation into the attack began immediately. Detectives combed through every detail of Natsumi's life, searching for answers. Her home was searched, her bedroom revealing a chilling glimpse into her mind. Sketchbooks filled with dark, violent imagery lay stacked in a corner, their pages depicting scenes eerily similar to the events at the school. Her computer, confiscated and analyzed, revealed hours spent on forums discussing revenge, isolation, and violence. Journal entries, scrawled in uneven handwriting, detailed her growing anger toward her classmates and her meticulous planning of the attack. Each discovery painted a picture of a girl consumed by pain and resentment, pushed to the edge by years of neglect and cruelty. As the investigation unfolded, so too did the public's fascination with the case. News programs aired endless debates about the societal pressures that might have driven Natsumi to commit such an atrocity. Experts dissected her life, her struggles with bullying, and the culture of academic pressure that permeated Nishikawa Academy. Parents demanded answers from the school administration, accusing them of failing to notice the warning signs and protect their students. The school's reputation, once untouchable, was now tarnished, its name synonymous with tragedy. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was a nightmare from which they could not wake. 19 lives had been lost, each one leaving behind grieving parents, siblings, and friends. The school held a memorial service a week after the attack, its assembly hall filled with mourners clutching photographs of their loved ones. Flowers and candles lined the steps of the building, a somber testament to the lives that had been cut short. Survivors of the attack, some still bearing visible injuries, sat in the crowd, their expressions vacant as they listened to eulogies and prayers. Natsumi's trial became a national spectacle. Despite her age, the court proceedings were covered extensively by the media, every detail scrutinized and debated. Psychologists testified about her mental state, offering conflicting opinions. Some argued that she had acted out of a psychotic break, her actions the result of untreated mental illness and years of isolation. Others claimed that the attack was premeditated and calculated, a deliberate act of revenge against those who had wronged her. Natsumi herself offered no insight, remaining silent throughout the trial, her face a blank mask as the proceedings unfolded around her. The court ultimately ruled her guilty but mentally ill, sentencing her to indefinite confinement in a high-security juvenile psychiatric facility. The verdict sparked further controversy, with some calling it too lenient and others questioning whether punishment was even the right approach for someone so deeply damaged. For the survivors and the families of the victims, the ruling brought little closure. The memories of that day remained fresh, the pain of loss too deep to be healed by a legal decision. Inside the facility, Natsumi became an enigma. She participated in therapy sessions and evaluations but rarely spoke, her silence frustrating the staff tasked with her care. Her sketches, once violent and chaotic, grew softer, depicting scenes of solitude, empty rooms, distant landscapes, and shadowy figures standing alone. The doctor saw glimpses of remorse in her work, but without words they could never be sure. Her days were marked by a monotonous routine, the hours blending together in the sterile, windowless environment of the facility. Nishikawa Academy, though reopened, was never the same. The classroom where the attack occurred was permanently sealed, a grim reminder of what had happened. Security measures were heightened, with metal detectors installed and counselors brought in to help students process their trauma. The school's enrollment numbers dwindled as parents pulled their children from what was once considered a haven of excellence. The tragedy became part of its legacy, a shadow that could never be erased. For Natsumi, the aftermath was a void. The storm of anger and despair that had driven her to act had passed, leaving her hollow. She spent her days in silence, her mind replaying the events of that day over and over. The faces of her classmates haunted her, their screams echoing in the quiet of her cell. She had wanted to be seen, to make them understand her pain, but now she wondered if they had ever truly looked at her at all. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the price she had paid to be remembered. The investigation into the massacre at Nishikawa Academy began immediately, the weight of its horror propelling law enforcement and forensic teams into action. The crime scene was meticulously documented, every detail preserved for analysis. Blood covered the classroom floor, desks overturned in the chaos, and scattered personal belongings painted a haunting picture of the last moments of the victims. The investigators moved with grim efficiency, their faces pale but determined as they collected evidence, aware that the eyes of the entire nation were on them. Natsumi Hayashi's arrest on the scene provided an unusual starting point for the investigation. Unlike most crimes of such magnitude, there was no hunt for the perpetrator. The quiet, blood-stained girl had been taken into custody without resistance, her calm demeanor unsettling the officers who escorted her away. But her arrest left them with as many questions as answers. How could a 15-year-old girl commit such a calculated and brutal act? What had driven her to this breaking point, and how had no one seen it coming? The first pieces of evidence came from Natsumi herself. Her uniform, soaked in blood, was sent to the lab, where forensic experts confirmed that the stains matched the victims. The knives she had used were recovered from the classroom floor, their blades bearing traces of multiple victims' DNA. Her school bag, still at her desk, contained more knives wrapped in cloth, unused but ready for further violence if the attack had continued. Each piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: the act had been premeditated, meticulously planned, and executed with chilling precision. The investigation expanded into Natsumi's personal life, peeling back the layers of her existence to uncover the roots of her actions. Her home was searched, and her bedroom became a focal point for understanding her state of mind. The walls were bare, the room sparsely furnished, but it was the contents of her desk that drew the investigators' attention. Sketchbooks, stacked neatly, contained disturbing imagery, dark, chaotic drawings of violence, shadowy figures, and scenes of confinement. Journal entries, written in erratic handwriting, revealed a mind consumed by anger and despair. The writings detailed her growing resentment toward her classmates, her feelings of invisibility, and her desire for revenge. One chilling entry read like a blueprint for the attack, listing the names of her targets and the order in which she planned to strike. Natsumi's online activity provided further insight. Her computer was confiscated, and its contents painted a picture of a girl seeking solace in the darkest corners of the internet. She had frequented forums that glorified violence and revenge, engaging with posts that mirrored her own feelings of alienation. She had researched weapons, read detailed accounts of similar tragedies, and participated in discussions about societal rejection and personal empowerment through violent means. Each click, each search term, added to the narrative that Natsumi's actions had been months in the making. Interviews with Natsumi's classmates and teachers further deepened the understanding of her motives. Students described her as a quiet, withdrawn girl who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Some admitted to bullying her, their voices trembling with guilt as they recounted the pranks and insults they had directed at her. They described how she often sat alone during lunch, how her belongings were frequently vandalized, and how she seemed to absorb every slight without retaliation. Teachers, too, shared their observations, noting her declining grades and increasingly detached demeanor but admitting they had not intervened, dismissing her behavior as typical teenage withdrawal. The school environment itself became a target of scrutiny. Nishikawa Academy, with its high-pressure atmosphere and rigid social hierarchies, was revealed to be a breeding ground for isolation and resentment. Investigators uncovered a culture of unchecked bullying, where the most vulnerable students were left to fend for themselves while teachers focused solely on academic achievements. Parents of other students came forward, sharing stories of their children's struggles with the school's unrelenting expectations and the toxic dynamics among its students. Nishikawa Academy's reputation, once pristine, was now marred by the revelation that it had fostered an environment where a tragedy like this could occur. As the evidence mounted, psychologists and criminal profilers were brought in to analyze Natsumi's mental state. Their assessments were varied but painted a picture of a deeply troubled individual. Some argued that she suffered from severe depression and anxiety, compounded by years of bullying and neglect, which had driven her to lash out in a moment of desperation. Others believed her actions were the result of a calculated, pathological need for control and recognition, suggesting that she had planned the attack as a way to force the world to acknowledge her pain. Despite their differing interpretations, all agreed that Natsumi's actions were a culmination of factors: personal trauma, societal pressure, and a lack of intervention. The media seized on the story, sensationalizing every detail. News outlets dissected Natsumi's life, her writings, and her online activity, creating a narrative that oscillated between portraying her as a victim of circumstance and a cold-blooded killer. Pundits debated the role of bullying, mental health, and the pressures of academic life in creating the conditions for such a tragedy. Parents across the nation demanded accountability from schools, while others called for harsher punishments for juvenile offenders. Natsumi's name became infamous, her face splashed across newspapers and television screens, her silence only fueling the public's morbid fascination. The investigation concluded with a trial that captivated the nation. Natsumi, now detained in a juvenile psychiatric facility, remained silent throughout the proceedings, her expression unreadable. Psychologists testified about her mental state, her isolation, and her apparent detachment from reality. Prosecutors argued that her actions were deliberate and calculated, pointing to the evidence of her meticulous planning. The defense painted her as a broken child pushed to her limits by a lifetime of neglect and torment. The court ultimately found her guilty but mentally ill, sentencing her to indefinite treatment in a secure facility. Despite the verdict, the revelations left behind more questions than answers. How had no one noticed the signs? Could the tragedy have been prevented? And what did it say about a society that allowed a 15-year-old girl to fall so far into despair? Natsumi's case became a symbol of the hidden cracks in Japan's pristine exterior, a reminder that beneath its surface of order and success lay a darker reality that could no longer be ignored.